Hi, you're listening to the Syntalks podcast, created and produced by the International Genetically Engineered Machine team, or iGEM for short, at the University of Toronto, where we conduct interviews with experts in the field of synthetic biology and its various uses. My name is Arjun Kaul. I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Toronto, going into my fourth year, majoring in neuroscience and cell and molecular biology, and minoring in English. I'm also a member of the Policy and Practices branch of the University of Toronto's iGEM team. In this episode, we'll be talking to Dr. Grace Skogstad, a professor here at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses on comparative public policy, where she looks at the various subtleties of agricultural and food policy, as well as regulatory policies for biofuels and GMOs, and the effects that they can have on broader society. Welcome, Dr. Skogstad. We're glad to have you with us on our podcast. So, in the simplest terms, what's your research about?
My research is looking at why different countries regulate plant biotechnology differently, and plant biotechnology, of course, refers to genetically modified crops and foods. And it's very interesting for me because there's a lot of conflict around the regulation of genetically modified crops and foods. And in addition to that amount of conflict, there are huge differences across countries in terms of how they've chosen to regulate GM crops and foods.
Okay, that's very interesting. And what are, in your terms, what are the real-life implications of your research?
Well, the real-life implications are substantial. For farmers who started to grow the crops and who do grow GM crops, the promise there has always been economic gain, that they would reduce their costs of production and be more competitive vis-a-vis competitors. So there are real economic gains and losses here. The other thing, of course, is that for other people who are not quite so interested in the economic part of the economic profits of biotechnology, there are concerns around the social and economic implications of this, and the ethical concerns as well regarding whether it's right to tamper with nature, because we are genetically modifying organisms. So there's substantial economic, social, ethical concerns. And, those are very real. They've had important implications for trade across countries. The European Union, for example, has a very restrictive regulatory regime when it comes to the importation of GM plants. And that, of course, has affected North American farmers, most of whom, if you're growing corn or if you're growing canola, you're growing GM crops. And so they found their access into the European Union market restricted.
Mm-hmm. So what initially sparked your interest in the field in terms of both research into biotechnology and the policy surrounding biotechnology, as well as research just surrounding food policy and food policy?
Yeah. Well, political scientists, I'm a political scientist, tend to be interested in conflict. And so we kind of follow the conflict the way, I guess fire trucks follow fires. And so I really got interested when it was very clear that you had, in Europe, you have environmental groups that were organizing to stop the importation of GM plants, seeds. And in North America, there's been much less controversy, but in Canada, we had a very famous case where a farmer in Saskatchewan, Percy Schmeiser, was found growing a GM crop when he hadn't purchased the actual GM seed. And of course, you probably know that the companies that produce the GM seed patent it, and so every year you have to buy your seed again. And that was really very contrary to traditional farming practices, where farmers would hang on to their seed and some of their crop every year and replant it the next. So this was a very famous case where Percy Schmeiser argued that the GM crop must have blown onto his own field when he was found to have a whole field of GM canola. And so that went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. Now, it was highly contentious, as I say. Percy Schmeiser lost. But these are the GM crops have aroused a lot of emotion. They've aroused a lot of they've caused a lot of mobilization on the part of environmental groups and some other public advocacy groups. And so for political scientists, we want to understand, okay, under what circumstances do social movements, farmers get mobilized, and then who wins and loses. And in the winning and the losing, the thing that really matters most is how governments regulate these novel technologies and how the courts decide themselves whether the regulations that governments are bringing in are fair, whether they're legal. So it's the controversy that's got me very interested here.
Speaking of the controversy and sort of the strong emotions surrounding GMOs that you were talking about, so our podcast aims to educate the public about genetically modified organisms. What is your personal informed opinion about GMOs and sort of the possibly past but still ongoing hysteria surrounding the idea of GMOs?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's never been a scientific study that's shown that they've been harmful to human health, right? So the science on this is that they're safe for humans to consume. Where there seems to have been a bit more scientific controversy or disagreement or division is around their effects on the environment. And so there are questions about whether GM crops are sort of super crops that can then invade other species and sort of overwhelm them. So again, there is some division among scientists on that. But in terms of the actual safety for you and I to be consuming GM crops, I don't think that there's any evidence at all that they're unsafe. So it comes down really much more to whether people want to eat them or not. It's a matter of preference rather than, I think, of safety.
Mm-hmm. So you described briefly some worries about some ongoing worries about the idea of playing God with the audience can't see that I'm using quotation marks, but playing God with GMOs. Can you describe how that's factored into sort of to policy about GMO regulation?
Well, it's not in Canada. I mean, Canada and the United States regulate GM organisms entirely on scientific grounds. Is there scientific evidence that they pose any risks at all to the environment or to human health? And if there's any evidence that they do pose such risks, then the regulation is around containing those risks, right? Making sure. But if there are health risks, they wouldn't even get on the market, right? But if there are environmental risks, then there would be rules around, how you would have to have barriers around a field, for example, so it wouldn't contaminate a GM field, so it wouldn't contaminate a non-GM crop. So those are some of the concerns. Just remind me again, what else that you were asking for by way of an answer here?
Possibly how sort of different fears about things like ideas like playing God have...
Playing God, yeah. So they're not at all in Canada, but in the case of Europe, it's not so much playing God as the question around social, economic, and ethical concerns. I guess the ethical concern is really the playing God concern, but it really does boil down to a question of whether science alone should be the determinant of whether the products are licensed and sold on the market, planted and then sold, or whether you should take into considerations like social and economic concerns, because there have been some concerns around the fact that, farmers, as I mentioned earlier, have to buy their seeds if you're going to use grow a GM crop, you have to buy your seeds every year. So there's concern that poorer farmers can't afford that, only richer farmers can. The idea of a society, society doesn't want these products on the market. Why should society be forced to have them on the market? So then you get into a whole, another regulatory issue, and that's around the labeling of these products. So in Europe, there's a fairly rigorous labeling system so that if any product contains more than 0.09% GM content, it has to be labeled. In Canada and in the United States, we don't label. There's no mandatory labeling. It's left up to the food manufacturer to indicate whether or not a product contains a GM content, and they've basically chosen not to put any labeling on.
Mm-hmm. So, speaking briefly of the idea of what you were saying about economic disparity and how these affect sort of poorer farmers, if you could talk to sort of individuals in developing countries about GMOs, what would you say? So would you say that they should have similar fears or similar worries or different worries? How would this affect them differently?
Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely right that the implications for countries, for farmers in developing countries are quite a bit different than they are for farmers in, say, the United States, Canada, and Europe, where farmers do tend to be, they're subsidized quite often by the government, and so they are, we may have some poor farmers, but it's not the same consideration as in Africa and some of the poor countries of Asia, where the idea that you have to buy your seed again every year from the plant biotechnology company, I mean, that's a cost. Then the additional concern is that if you grow a GM crop, and Europe is one of your major markets, you won't be able to sell it there unless, you've basically conformed to all the standards that the European Union has. So there's the economic implication there of growing a GM crop and losing your traditional market. So the other worry, of course, is that in developing countries, they may not have, and they usually don't have, the same degree of rigor in their safety regulations, right? I mean, we have a lot of good scientists in the developed world, United States, Canada, Europe, who really are very capable of assessing the risks of these, of any novel technology. But we can't assume that there will be the same safety systems and the same degree of rigor around safety and inspection in developing countries. So there are real implications, particularly for developing countries, and some of them have then, of course, chosen not to grow GM crops while others have.
Mm-hmm. So, if you were able to talk to the public about where they should begin to look to determine the safety of GMOs and to find out these things for themselves, where should they begin to look? Should they begin to jump into scientific papers, or? Yeah,
I mean, I think the thing is certainly you want to read the scientific papers, and you will probably come to the same conclusion most people do about what their risks are. But I think the other thing that scientists always have to be aware of is that, what scientists' evaluation of a risk is not necessarily going to be the non-scientist's evaluation of a risk. Can be quite a gap between the risks, the perception of risks, and the scientifically determined risks. And that is exactly what we've seen around genetically modified organisms, that they're just, the public perception in some places, and this is clearly not everywhere, but in some quarters is just very different from what scientists think. And so maybe that the non-public includes other risks that the scientists wouldn't include, but for all scientists, you need to be aware that good science is not necessarily consumed by the public. I mean, there are values that enter into these judgments. There's the public often just doesn't have the same degree of expertise to be able to evaluate the risks.
Mm-hmm. So there are probably many students out there who are aspiring to do research similar to yours on the finer points of GMO policy and trade policy. What's your advice to those students, and where should they start to look?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't really advocate for public policies at all. I mean, I consider myself an academic, which is much more interested in analyzing controversies, and I don't go out and advocate for policies. But I do think, that anybody who is interested in translating their scientific knowledge into good public policy does have to always recognize this wider context, that politicians are going to be responsive to public concerns, right? And that a lot of this is about communicating objectively what the risks are of a new technology like plant biotechnology, but it is also about when there is a downside to a technology, if there is, it's about also communicating that. It's not just emphasizing all the benefits, but being aware that there can be potential costs, and that the costs of a new technology don't usually fall evenly across all people. They will fall disproportionately sometimes on a particular part of the population. And so, I just think that, we absolutely need good scientists, but we also need scientists who are very, very much aware of the wider context within which politicians and policymakers generally make public policies.
That's it for our conversation with Dr. Skogstad and the Environment Podcast series as a whole. Make sure to check us out on other social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you so much for listening. Stay tuned for our next series, where we'll be looking at synthetic biology's impact on the world of engineering. Until then, this is Arjun signing off on the Syntalks podcast.